looking at the relationship between those three things. So how does power operate in a crisis? Who grabs power? Who steps back? What types of power exacerbate a crisis? Is it a spur to transformation? Is it a distraction from systemic transformation? And what is this systemic transformation? Take note of the proliferation of supermarkets and malls, the altars of money. They best describe the detour from grace. Keep track of the errors of our forgetfulness. The fog steals our children while we sleep. We no longer know the names of the birds here, how to speak to them by their personal names. Crucial to finding the way is this: there is no beginning and no end. You must make your own map.
And perhaps we can just invite one or two voices from each group before we do the fishbowl. Just a bit more of saying or impressions, what you got from your group.
That we need a practical understanding of the levers for systemic change, not just an academic one, and perhaps some more hands-on experiments where we act as systems, acknowledging that we are part of certain systemic barriers or enablers. The way in which we act within those contexts often play a role in transforming or redirecting those systems.
So how do we use language lately, proactive language, pointing out how two very different statements can create very different senses of responsibility.
So we would be going into the fishbowl, and I'm wondering if we can incorporate parts of what's coming up next for us. Just a raise of hand for those who are familiar with doing a fishbowl online.
One of the things that arose for me out of that conversation about of First Peoples or Indigenous knowledge and skills, understandings of the natural rhythms on Earth and planet, and how we don't listen to those.
The two elements there that are on top of mind are the power of creating that label or removing it, and also the crisis that is because we're not listening to what is said, but who said it or how it was said and what it was called. Let's remove labels. Let's look at the words and the wisdom.
And if we broadly accept that, but also accept that we do not necessarily know exactly what to do about it, then let us co-create the questions we need to be holding to move us forward or navigate the current context.
I must be, as BJ said, personally responsible for how I act and how I am in the world. But also, to have power to effect change, to have an impact, I do need the other. The other is essential.
I like the question of how might we be able to remove the labels so that we can listen and tune in well.
The problem becomes when I want to look at a given narrative from a monocultural point of view. I want to interpret it, understand, intervene. I was an officer who was educated and born and brought up elsewhere, who just walked in this part of the country, which is all tribal, indigenous communities. And nobody in the village had a watch. And this man said, no, you're not as human as I think you ought to be unless you carry a watch and stick to it. He represents that monoculture which says there's only one time and there is only one idea of that time, and there cannot be alternate. Labeling per se is not a problem. The problem is that we tend to stick to certain labels and we're not open to listening to other labels. We need to understand that there are these multiple versions. Each one of them is as respectable as mine. I need to negotiate between these narratives. So do I have the necessary skills, tools, methods to be able to negotiate, understand what are the competing memes, competing narratives, and negotiate between them?
I agree with Rohit. We need multiple stories. The thing is, they need to be co-created. One thought would be to bring different actors together in a setting like this where no one's status is clear, and have them co-create not one story, but new stories. Broad outlines of the story, if you will. The new narrative is one of what the emerging narrative for me is an eco-social narrative, ecological and social. It's not just about humans, but it's about humans in the context of other than human beings, that as part of nature, not as separate from nature. And that's a very old story. And for many of us in Western cultures, it's a very new story. How do we evolve those stories and understandings with people who already have
Our time is almost up. I have found that incredibly rich. The breakout groups just blew my mind. Harvesting that back in the fishbowl was a great rehearsal for our next couple of meetings. I was struck by John's bringing in questions, the power of questions. As you're leaving, what question are you left with that might help us pick up next time?